Thank you, Sherif. And I want to thank everyone for coming. It's a privilege for us to be speaking to this group and on this topic. To this group because the young professionals that come to CIC events really are both the future of this nation and the future of the church. And so to a certain extent, what the future of marriage will be is up to you. It's a privilege to be talking about this topic because I think there's nothing that could be more important, both for the future of the church and the future of the nation, than the health of the marriage culture. And so what I'll get at during the brief time that I speak is why marriage is so important, why the state's involved in it. And then also, I want to address how to talk about the topic. I work at a think tank, a public policy think tank. So one of the things that I do is, I help people with messaging, help elected officials, help their staff. I do a lot of radio and TV interviews, things like that, a lot of writing on this question. And so kind of talk about how to talk about this. One caveat is that it's important that we view that being for marriage does not entail being anti-gay, nor does it excuse being anti-gay. And so one of the things that I think people who are in support of marriage, rightly understood, should be at the forefront of is condemning the very real acts of gay bashing that take place. But at the same time, we shouldn't be kind of self-loathing into thinking that speaking out into the defense of the truth about marriage therefore makes someone a homophobe or a bigot or on the wrong side of history or anything like that. So it takes some effort to walk the fine line of condemning animus when and where you see it, but not thinking that actually being in favor of marriage is one of those instances. So that said, I want to make 4 points. I want to talk about situating the current debate about marriage within the history of the marriage movement. And if you don't know what the marriage movement is, that's because of the media, and so it'll be helpful to think through this. The second thing is to ask, why is the state in the marriage business in the first place? The state's not in the friendship business. It's not in the older brother, younger sister business. Why are they in the marriage business? The third is to think through what would the harms be of redefining marriage to include same-sex couples. And then the fourth is to talk about the future of marriage, our role in the future of marriage, and whether or not we're on the wrong side of history. Okay, so point one, the original marriage movement. Sexual revolution takes place throughout the 60s and 70s. It delinks a bunch of goods and people that the marriage culture had tried to connect. It delinks sex from commitment. It delinks babies from marriage. It delinks sex from marriage from babies. The social fallout of this, so if you think about things like premarital sex, out-of-wedlock childbearing, divorce, cohabitation, all these relatively new phenomena that take place in the 60s, 70s, is a lot of social consequence, social harm, increase in poverty, decrease in social mobility, a bunch of all the social science that we have that can look at what the result of a child born out of wedlock. It's really quite bad. And so you get a series of activists and scholars, now it's in the late 70s, early 80s, 90s, who are writing books with titles like Fatherless America, Confronting America's Most Urgent Social Problem, Enemies of Eros, How the Sexual Revolution is Destroying America and What We Can Do About It. The first two, the books that I just mentioned, are by David Blankenhorn and Maggie Gallagher, who were the star kind of leading voices and star witnesses during the Prop 8 trial, being labeled by the media as, oh, they're just anti-gay bigots. But back in the 80s and 90s, when they started working on the marriage question, when they started leading something known as the marriage movement, the concept of same-sex marriage wasn't even a logical possibility, let alone was it on anyone's radar screen. No one was thinking about this because no one even thought it was a possibility. And so no one who got involved in strengthening the marriage culture was doing this out of any feeling one way or the other about gay relationships. It was just utterly beyond the point. The reason they did this and the organizations that they founded and the coalitions that they formed was that they saw that Midnight Basketball and Head Start and various government-run healthcare programs, things like that, weren't what kids needed most. What kids needed most was a mother and a father who had committed to each other and who had committed to that child. And that the institution that did this was marriage. And that insofar as we had walked away, backed away, destroyed a marriage culture, children were the innocent victims of this. And that there was no government substitute for a married mom and dad. And that if you want to look at the social pathologies that follow through, just read any social scientist that was writing on marriage and the family up until about the year 2003. It was only when gay marriage became a primetime topic that sociologists started having second thoughts about whether or not moms and dads matter and whether or not marriage matters. So that's some history, just to think about the framing of this. The leaders of the marriage movement during the 80s and 90s were interested in marriage, not something known as gay marriage. And they were interested in it because it benefits the spouses who live according to its norms and the children who are reared within its confines. In 2003, the Massachusetts Supreme Court more or less creates a right to same-sex marriage for the state of Massachusetts. It's the first court in the country to do this. It's the Goodridge decision. And so this will now be point two. So I'll back up. So the leaders of the marriage movement now have to ask themselves, will recognizing same-sex relationships as marriages strengthen the marriage culture? Or for all of the reasons that Sherif kind of went through in his portion of the talk, will it redefine marriage away from all of the marital norms that we've been trying to emphasize about how monogamy and sexual exclusivity and permanency and marital childbearing and rearing actually serve the spouses, the kids, and society as a whole? And that was the question that they asked themselves. Maggie Gallagher writes about this. She speaks about how she was at a meeting with the leaders of the marriage movement who had been working on this for the past 20 years, and they actually had to stop and ask themselves, like, wait, are we in favor of gay marriage or not? And they actually had to have that conversation. And that's where kind of the past 10 years, where the real focus has been on redefining marriage, same-sex marriage has come in. Okay, so point two, why is the state in the marriage business in the first place? This can be straightforward. The state doesn't really have an interest in my friendship with Sherif or my mentorship with Robbie or anything like that. It leaves free citizens free to live as they want to live. Why is it in the state's interest to regulate marriage? Simple answer. Marriage connects a man and a woman as husband and wife to be equipped to be father and mother to the children that their union creates. Now, the state can either do this more or less restrictively, more or less coercively, more or less intrusively. And so it can upfront promote the institution of marriage through its policies and laws, tax breaks, things like that, to try to encourage adults to commit to each other and then to take responsibility for their kids. Or the state can be left picking up the pieces with a very intrusive welfare system, a judiciary system that, more or less criminal justice system, police force, police state. If you want to look at why the rise of the welfare state happens when it happens historically, why the rise of our prison populations take place when it happens historically, why we're going bankrupt right now, a lot of it has to do with the breakdown of the family that the original leaders of the marriage movement were combating. So the state's interest is we will restrain ourselves. It's in the interest of limited government for us to encourage adults, men and women, to commit to each other and to their children so we're not left picking up the pieces. And it's not just out of like the state's interest and of, we don't want to go bankrupt, but it's also in the interest of the children. Think about it this way. How can the state make sure that these highly needy, totally vulnerable newborns develop into the position where they can be constructive citizens? Because what the state needs is citizens. In the states that aren't reproducing right now, the countries in Europe that all of a sudden, they're just depopulating, they're discovering how bad it is when you don't have citizens. How does the state get citizens? They can't create them out of, ex nihilo. The state can't raise the kids themselves, so the state needs to encourage adults to have and rear kids. It can do this through marriage by incentivizing a certain type of relationship, while at the same time, the state need not criminalize or ban or discriminate against any other form of voluntary adult activity. So one of the most frustrating talking points that the other side uses in this debate is they'll say, why are you in favor of banning gay marriage? And then they'll say, 31 states have voted to ban gay marriage. Gay marriage is not illegal anywhere in America. You can be in any state in America and go to a liberal church and have that church bless your union. You can work for a liberal employer and have that employer give you spousal benefits if the church and if the employer chooses to. You're free to live and love as you see fit, and your church and your employer is free to recognize your union as they see fit. The question about redefining marriage to include same-sex couples is to coerce everyone else in society, including people who don't think the union of a man and a woman, or a man and a woman, and whatever other permutations you want to put this together in, are marriages. So the coercion element, the libertarian element, works in the exact opposite way than it's typically portrayed. Okay, so I'll go to point three, likely harms. the primary harm of redefining marriage isn't that, if Sherif and I got married, somehow this would harm you in your marriage, or somehow like we would be harming kids directly and tangibly in the way that we're not planning on getting married, just to clarify.
I would be very unhappy. I would be harmed.
Yes. My brother says our mother. Yes. Okay. All right. So
I'm on her side.
the way to think about this, and there's a parallel here with the pro-life movement. It's very easy in the culture that we live in. We talk about rights and we talk about harms, and those are the two primary, the currency of discourse. We go, well, I have a right to something, or you can't do that because it harms me. It violates my rights. And one reason why we've been more successful in the right to life issue is that we can point to a victim. And you can look at an ultrasound picture, you can look at a bloody fetus. It's very clear who the victim, what the harm is of abortion. The harm of redefining marriage will be just as real, but it'll be more diffuse and it'll take place over time. So it won't be as immediate, it won't be as particular. And so one way of thinking about this is thinking what we did when we redefined marriage to exclude the normative expectation of permanency. So think about reforms in divorce laws during the 60s and 70s when the introduction of no-fault divorce. Jenny Roback Morris calls it unilateral divorce because more or less it's the only contract, it's the easiest contract to get out of in American law right now because you can get out of the marriage contract for any reason or no reason at all without any penalty, without any negative judgment. That's what the no-fault part of no-fault divorce is. So it's not going to, it used to be that if you filed for divorce, you could assign fault to one of the parties of the marriage. Someone cheated on someone, someone's abusing someone, and that would then play out in how alimony was assigned, how child support was assigned, how parental custody was assigned. It took account of this, and the expectation was one of permanency, except for when a grievous fault was committed, and then that was the grounds for divorce. Changing the law, the legal definition of marriage to include no-fault divorce, then impacted how people understood what marriage is. Permanency is a nice additional thing if it happens to work out for you, but marriage now is just as long as the love lasts. When the love dies out, get out of the marriage. What we now see is 50% of marriages end in divorce. Law shaped belief, belief shapes action, action then has consequences. Children of divorce, on average, according to all of the best social science we have, don't turn out as well as kids that have the benefit of their mom and dad committed to each other and to them until they're raised to maturity. And that's not, it's hard to say that because a lot of people, when 50% of marriages end in divorce, it sounds like you're casting judgment. But this is why it's in the interest of the state to support a sound marriage culture. So if that's the case with no-fault divorce, what would changing the law to eliminate sexual complementarity, to eliminate the ideal that marriage requires a man and a woman, husband and wife, mother and father, and so that marriage is primarily what Sherif described it as, just an intense emotional union. One, it makes no sense whatsoever of the marital norms, as Sherif really well explained. Permanency, exclusivity, monogamy, fidelity, none of those norms make sense if it's just an intense emotional relationship. And one of the things we document in the book is we just go chapter and verse through, dozens and dozens of leading LGBT activists, people leading the push for redefining marriage, who will come out and say, yeah, it doesn't need to be between two people. The New York Times interviewed Dan Savage, which Savage? Dan Savage. Dan Savage. And I think the title of the article was Monogamish. And his idea here was that, look, one of the things that will be good about redefining marriage to include gay couples is that gay couples can then teach straight couples the joys of sexual extramarital outlets. So more or less he was saying infidelity can now be weaved into, grafted onto heterosexual marriages, and this will have great impact. No, what it'll do is it'll create fragmented families because when straight folk have non-marital sex, frequently 9 months later, a child arrives. And now there's not the commitment between man and woman, husband and wife, mother and father that takes place there. And so it has social consequences. That would be one harm, is that redefining the norms, redefining marriage makes little sense of the norms so that norms will be lived out less. Another thing, that makes it impossible for someone to say that dads matter. So if you think about what got the activists and the scholars involved in this in the first place, it was absentee dads. Fatherless America was the title of the book. The increase in crime was because dads weren't there to keep their sons in gear. If two women in a lesbian relationship using maybe artificial insemination, anonymous sperm donation, something like that, is the same thing as a marriage, and it's bigotry to say otherwise, how can you, consistent with that, say that kids need a mom and a dad? To say that kids need a mom and a dad is now to be judgmental against the new definition of marriage, in which two women or two men are the equivalent. And so in that way, it's a longer-term harm, in that already we have a culture that has devalued the role of fathers. And it'll be hard to rebuild the culture that stresses the importance of fathers when you've redefined them out of the institution. Last point, and I'll go through this more quickly. One of the questions that Sherif and I receive a lot from family, friends, coworkers, colleagues is, why did you do this? You have these great credentials. Like, one of you is a Rhodes Scholar doing a law degree at Yale, a PhD at Princeton. One of you has less good degree, Notre Dame, and, whatever, We have a good football team, better than Yale and Princeton. And I was a music major at Princeton, so it was really, unemployment one way or the other. So they asked, why did you do this? And because the way that it'll be, George Will, it was, I guess, 2 weeks ago on ABC's This Week, said, look, the only people left in support of traditional marriage are dying. He says, they're more or less, it's old people, they're literally dead. And the answer to that is, look, demography isn't destiny to a certain extent. And the best way to think about this is to think what happened 40 years ago this January. So I'll make another allusion, another parallel to the pro-life movement. January 22nd, 1973, the Supreme Court issues the Roe v. Wade decision. The next day, January 23rd, 1973, front page headline above the fold, New York Times, big bold letters, Supreme Court settles the abortion issue. 40 years later, we can see how embarrassingly narrow and closed-minded and just kind of they believed their own elite talking points. There's no question in American public life less settled than the abortion question. And you can think about what happened shortly thereafter. All of the media kind of analysis was that the only people who were pro-life were octogenarians, were these old elderly priests, the Pope and the Vatican and Rome. At the time, even the Southern Baptists were pro-choice at the time. They weren't pro-life at the time. So it was like, look, it's a Catholic thing. All of the elites are in favor of this. All of the young people are in favor of abortion. One by one, you had public figures, start the list with Ted Kennedy, Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Jesse Jackson. They were all pro-life. One by one, they evolve, just like our current president. They see the light, they become pro-choice. And then everyone says, look, you're on the wrong side of history. 10, 20 years from now, there won't even be a pro-life movement. It'll be over. What happens instead? You get people who develop the arguments, first the science, the philosophy, the law. You get people like Ed Meese, our colleague at the Heritage Foundation. He was President Reagan's Attorney General. He comes up with kind of, what are we going to do legally to get the right appointments, the right people on the Supreme Court? How do we get Scalia and Thomas and these people on the court? How do we come up with the right policies? Henry Hyde has to come up with the Hyde Amendment, Born Alive Infant Protection Act, partial birth abortion bans, incremental movements. Come up with the organizations, National Right to Life, Americans United for Life. One by one, arguments had to be made, coalitions had to be formed, organizations had to be organized, and then witness had to be born. Witness for the witness of the truth for its own sake, but also for the sake of persuading hearts and minds. And now what's the result? 40 years later, our generation is more pro-life than our parents' generation. But that wouldn't have happened if it wouldn't have been for the scholars and the activists and the politicians and the policy wonks. And this is another point that we'll get into later, the donors, people who put up the money for this stuff. Because if you want to know why we lost this past November, it's because there were 4 marriage amendments that were on the ballot. We were outspent $10 million to $50 million. The other side spent $50 million. We spent 10. They were also in deep blue states, and we outperformed Romney. We can get into kind of the electoral analysis here. But the point is that people were willing to put skin in the game. And so that history isn't a blind force in which we're passive observers. History is chosen, and it's chosen by the participants, the actors, which includes everyone in this room. And so from our perspective, we're just now starting the debate, the discussion about what is marriage. And it's very providential that the Supreme Court decided to hear the Prop 8 and the DOMA decision 2 weeks ago, because it gives us now 6 months in which the nation will be interested in this topic. It'll be good for book sales, we hope. But more importantly, we think that it'll be good for actually educating the public, a generation of people who just haven't asked the question of what is marriage, Why does the state care, and how does marriage benefit society?